Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski. Today we're going to host Dr. Chad Waterbury. You may or may not know him from his days at T Nation. He's a very famous physical therapy doctor that's been writing for T Nation, previously Testosterone Magazine online, and he's a very, very well-known authority on muscle building and advanced techniques on rehabilitation. So Dr. Waterbury and I get into some of his favorite techniques for building muscle for what I would say is average to advanced average individuals. So maybe not as massively applicable to people who've been training for a really long time, although you can make the argument that the more advanced you are, the less you need. Dr. Waterbury advocates full body workouts about 3 times a week, and I think there's value in that. And if you've never done that before, I highly suggest you try. I actually write this into my programs a lot for people who are new into my world, my coaching clients and things like that, where I want them to learn to put more effort into less time. One of the worst paradigms people have in fitness is they ask, how many sets do I need? How many exercises do I need? And the answer is, it depends, obviously, but most people are doing so much and executing so poorly that they need that many sets, or because it's like cooking something on lukewarm, right? It's like, I want you guys to learn how to actually execute with effort and intensity. Perfect execution with effort and intensity is what you need, but most people are just diluting their effort and intensity over 12 sets or 15 sets or 20 sets. They never get anything done or never get anything accomplished because it's just always this lukewarm stimulus that never actually lights the fire to build the muscles. The idea of going through some phases with full body workouts, so you actually have to take advantage of every set that you are allowed to execute. It's a really cool opportunity, and I'll usually progress from a three times a week full body program to maybe 4 times a week with a half body program, and then maybe we go into a third body split. But this is a really cool place to start. If you haven't done this before, I suggest you try it. Try it for at least 3 weeks. You could do 3 times a week. Every other day is a really good place to start. And there's a lot of high-level bodybuilding authorities that actually advocate this. Just learning how to contract, because if you only get 4 sets or 3 sets for a body part, how much effort, how much intensity are you going to put into that set? The answer is probably a lot, right? It's the idea of, you got a gun to your head, go. And you only get one opportunity. And the first couple times you do it, you're going to feel like it was a waste of your time because you're probably used to, dragging it a little bit for your first few sets. But as you do it for 2 and 3 weeks or longer sometimes, you'll find that your ability to produce more work in fewer sets goes through the roof because now you're putting a sense of urgency on yourself. So Dr. Waterbury and I get into some of the signs of overtraining, his thought process on exercise selection, maximizing motor unit recruitment through tempos, really interesting conversation around tempos, tempo versus load for motor unit recruitment. Dr. Waterbury's got a super interesting background. He's obviously a PhD in physical therapy. He's also got a background in neurophysiology, which fascinated me because I'm a nervous system geek, and he studied some really interesting things in Parkinson's. We have a bit of a conversation about that too. So this is a really interesting conversation around training and really just shifting the paradigm. You guys know that my favorite thing in life to do is challenge my own beliefs and challenge my own paradigm. So I challenge you to challenge your beliefs and your paradigm about what exercise really needs to be. And you guys all know that the foundation in all progress, whether it be fat loss or muscle building, the foundation of progress is exercise execution, is exercise mastery. And it's not just mastery of the things that you watch everyone on YouTube do or everyone on Instagram do. It's mastery of exercise for your body. And if you haven't begun to master, your likelihood of getting maximum results in the shortest amount of time is effectively zero, which is why I created Hypertrophy Execution Mastery, my latest and greatest program. We've got thousands of people in there right now, absolutely crushing it. And I invite every one of you to check it out if you haven't already. You can check it out at hypertrophymastery.com. It's a 4-month course that's going to teach you how to do absolutely everything great for your body. Really, going down the path of minimizing the number of exercises, but mastering the ones that you're good at. Because one of the biggest mistakes I find in exercise is people, like I say, have done too many or doing too many exercises and doing them all poorly. So let's decrease the number of exercises we're doing, pick the ones that are really, really great for our body, learn how to set up most effectively for our body, and actually get the greatest bang for your buck with every single set, every single rep, every single workout. Enjoy the show with Dr. Chad Waterbury. Awesome, man. You have a book about building muscle as fast as possible. That's where I wanted to start because ultimately my demographic knows me for that reason. And I'd love to find our common ground, find our commonality, and find your approach. Most importantly, I know it's a high frequency approach, which I love. You mentioned some really unique splits. I'd love to have you share that with us and share your thought process.
Yeah, well, for most people, what I like is to do 3 full body workouts a week. That's what I like, the kind of foundation I start with. And I always use some sort of circuit because I'm trying to get optimal, rest periods between exercises. So,
yeah,
because if you're training especially if you're training for strength, you want to get that, the phosphocreatines to replenish. That takes, can take 5-6 minutes. So instead of just sitting around for 5 or 6 minutes between sets, it's clear that you can work other muscle groups during that time. So
same stuff I do.
Yeah. So it might be, I'll do a pull up, a dip, and a deadlift, and, have like 60 to 75 seconds rest between each one of those. So by the time you get back to the pull up, for instance, if that starts the circuit, then you've had about 5 minutes of rest. So it's just a more efficient way to train because I'm all about getting people in and out of the gym as quickly as possible so they can, practice their sport or live their life or do all the other things.
Yeah, man, that's exactly how I approach it. I call that primer phases. So giving the body enough time to recover, like we talked about, whether it be a strength focus or whether it just be a skill acquisition focus, right? Like a lot of people lack the skill of exercise. They don't have the ability to execute exercise with precision. And then they're stacking exercise on top of exercise and kind of eating away at the ability to sustain that skill. So that's definitely something like, everyone that comes into my world goes through that type of training just because I think it's absolutely necessary for both sides of that coin.
Yeah. It's very easy to get caught up into doing 12 sets, for the chest, and all that. It's just, it's like I say, you want to set off the stimulus for growth, but you don't want to overwhelm it. So I think people sometimes underestimate the amount of sets you need to really stimulate growth. So, when you go beyond that, then it's just a matter of, just accumulating fatigue. So I'd rather have someone quickly stimulate those strength and muscle gains and then come back maybe quicker than they expected and do it again. And that's that whole, sort of high frequency thing is part of, my whole philosophy.
Do you think a 3 time a week full body frequency is enough for people who have been training for a while, or is that, just for like average people?
Oh, I think it's great. A lot of the huge people in this industry, I've talked about bodybuilders and I could just go down the laundry list that said that when they really wanted to, get on the phase or they want to get really big and strong, that's, what they would kind of, revert back to. So I think it absolutely is optimal. Now, there's lots of nuances with this. There's like, okay, if you have an in-season, football player or basketball player, that's too much. I would, scale it back and, maybe do 2 full body workouts a week. But for just, the guy out there who's got some training experience or who's relatively, new to the training game, I think 3 full body workouts per week is definitely, I feel it's the best place to start. It doesn't mean, there's some people I design programs for that really like an upper lower split. And that's totally fine. They just, whatever, they prefer that. But I like to start people with, like I said, that 3 full body workouts.
Now, as someone starts to progress to the ability of being able to contract a tremendous amount of muscle, use a tremendous amount of load, how do you begin to manipulate the frequency, if at all?
So,
you have someone who comes in, they're a relative beginner and we know they need high frequency. As someone starts to accumulate the ability to use more load or contract more muscle tissue, you still believe that, like, how would you progress somebody from, 3 times a week to maybe needing less frequency?
So the training sessions itself, I'll just use a new set of exercises. I'll use different loading, which then of course affects the reps you're going to do. So the foundation, again, is 3 times per week, full body workouts, but I'll use all sorts of, different exercise variations. We'll alternate between single leg exercises and double leg exercises, and we'll, depend on their goal, we'll go up and down the rep scheme. We might, in one phase, be between like 6 and 12 reps, and another phase we might be going lower. We might do like 10 circuits of 3 reps. So there's just endless options, with that. And it just, again, comes down to their goals. Are they recovering well, with the 3 full body workouts per week? Do they want to really focus on a single muscle group? Like the guys like guy or gals, like, all right, I've got this great, development basically, throughout my body, but I feel like, my triceps need a little bit more work, or my deltoids or my calves or whatever. And then on top of that, as a supplement, I'll do some sort of high frequency training plan to bring up that lagging body part.
Awesome, man. I love the fact that you're challenging the paradigm, right? Like every other meathead in the world, I'm not calling you a meathead, but every other meathead in the world is like, hey man, I got to train this body part once a week. And because that's the way that bodybuilders do it. And I'm always the guy who's like, man, that just doesn't make any sense. And just, the first thing people need to start doing is thinking and paying attention to things like you mentioned, recovery, and are they actually responding? And is every body part responding the same way? Because, everyone just gets caught in this paradigm of, oh, I need to train, chest on Monday, back on Tuesday, legs on Wednesday. And without ever paying attention to, oh, this body part's developing really well and this one's not. So, well, maybe this one needs a little more frequency, or maybe this one needs a little more attention to detail in their execution, or whatever it happens to be. I love the idea of challenging the paradigm.
Yeah, I think, Ben, that you and I and the people out there can agree that it makes perfect, irrefutable sense that more training sessions for a muscle group will lead to more growth. I think we can all agree on that. The question then becomes recovery. How do you, make sure you recover? And that's where, it took me years before I even released my first HFT, high frequency training ebook. I had to experiment with protocols for about 2 years to really get it dialed in where I felt comfortable giving that information to the public, because, training a muscle group more often, it's, you want to keep your joints healthy, and, you don't want to have any sort of orthopedic issues. And that becomes, a whole art and science in itself of hitting muscles at different angles without overloading the joints. So what I say is the key, especially the high frequency training, is to overload the muscles more than the joints. Because for instance, triceps, guys want to really build up the size and strength of their triceps, and a skull crusher or a lying, dumbbell tricep extension, great exercise for your triceps, terrible exercise to do 4 or 5 days a week. You'll absolutely wreck your elbows. So,
well, because it doesn't fit most people, right? Just right. The exercise, you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. Yeah. So the programming becomes really, really important. And, that's, as I've gotten older, that's what I really try to educate people about, is better programming. Because, we all see on social media and Instagram, people doing crazy exercises and they get lots of views, but at the end of the day, I like I said, I just think I'm too old for that. Of like, I know, those basic fundamental exercises we all know, those compound movements, those are the ones that are going to help us the most. So what I want to do is help people better program those training sessions, better program their training cycle, so they can get the most strength and muscle gains and not get overwhelmed with recovery, and spare their joints so they can do this for many years to come. Because I'm sure, Ben, you're a lot like me, or a lot like Jay or our friends, where we just did all this terrible stuff in our 20s because we could get away with it. And then we start paying for it later on. So it's a tough sell to the younger audience, but in the end, it's just about the results. So I, do my best to program training cycles to give people the best results. And when they get the good results, then, and I'm not maybe necessarily telling the 23-year-old football player that he's really going to benefit in the long term, because I know it's not going to resonate with him, but I'll feel good knowing that, this approach will spare his joints and spare his disc and all that as he moves forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I've started doing or I've been doing for a long time now is kind of indoctrinating this idea around the core 40, like core 40 exercise that you need to do and never going more than that. Like so many people are trying to get fancy with exercises, right? Like I really believe the skill of exercise is the most important piece that everyone is missing. You know, everyone's worrying about working hard and how many reps and how many sets and how much volume and frequency and all that stuff is relevant. But without knowing how to properly execute the skill of these exercises, the likelihood of being able to load it sufficiently enough to build muscle is probably, you know, removed for most people. Most people can't do it. So I've limited the number of exercises. So it's probably like 4 to 5 exercises tops per body part that we cycle through on a, you know, somewhat regular basis. And like, yeah, once you get good at these first, and once you've mastered all these, then and only then can we expand the list of exercises you're able to do, rather than like you talk about the Insta famous, YouTube famous stars trying to, you know, stand their head balancing 17 Bosu balls off their ear. They're doing it to get views, but in reality, like, man, like yourself, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the guy who is, you know, sensationalizing things to get people's attention.
Yeah, I think those are terrific points. The first thing I want to say is, as my mentor Pavel Tsatsouline has said many times, strength is a skill. You're absolutely right. Sure, I mean, it is a absolute skill. You have to keep practicing, and there's a lot of nuances to how you perform a squat or a deadlift to get the most out of it and the least amount of, you know, stress, you know, on the joints. The other thing I'll say that I think often gets lost is, if you think about the greats in athletics, if you think about whoever it is from, you know, Muhammad Ali to, you know, to Hickson Gracie, to Michael Jordan, to all these people, when you see them in interviews, they all Bruce Lee, here's another perfect example everyone loves. They all say the same thing when they're asked how did they get so great. They mastered the basics. Yep. And it's just so easy to get distracted.
Coach John Wooden as well.
Yeah,
right?
Coach.
John
I mean, like you just go on and on. Every sport, you know, virtually every discipline, even outside of athletics, you have to master the basics. And I think that people don't spend enough time trying to master the basics. They just see some exercise like, wow, that looks crazy and cool. I've never seen that before. I want to try that. And they don't realize that for these guys, I'm not putting down any of these, you know, amazing athletes who are posting videos of themselves on Instagram or whatever, doing this crazy stuff, these high single leg box jumps or whatever. You know, you have to keep in mind that they went through a lot of training to be able to do that. And, you know, people often just want to skip right ahead and, no, I want to do the, you know, 36-inch single leg box jump. And they don't realize they spend a lot of time building their squat and building their deadlift and building these fundamental movement patterns so they could do something like that.
Sure. I mean, objectively, that's very different, right? Like if you're trying to do something for fun, if you're trying to do something for a show, that's great. But as far as like core, you know, muscle building focus, you know, the idea of acquiring a skill so that you can then load it appropriately is just, you know, I really think the missing link. Everyone's looking for the shiny red ball, right?
Yeah. Or you think of a powerlifting meet. You think of a guy who's trying to pull his PR in the deadlift and the form, you know, probably isn't optimal because it's massive strain. They're trying to go for the new record or whatever. And then people look at that and say, oh, it's okay to have this, you know, really rounded back, you know, when you're doing a 1 rep max or whatever, because so-and-so did it. You know, I saw in the video that he did it. But what that person was actually doing was doing all this really smart training leading up to that to build the resilience to be able to withstand something like that. It's just like a sport like football, you know, which is so chaotic, and, you know, the injury rate is, you know, everyone's injured. So you want to be sure that you're building the athlete's durability, making them resilient. And that comes from really technical, skilled strength training. So when they get out there, then you haven't expose them to all this unnecessary damage leading up to it. And then you just cross your fingers and hope that that nasty blow they took, like, you know, Gronkowski, you know, I'm a Patriots fan, like Gronkowski, you know, that time a few seasons ago in full stride landing, you know, full stride trying to catch the ball and just gets nailed, you know, a lateral hit to his knee, blows out his ACL. You know, it's really hard to keep something like that from happening, but you do the best you can to build the resiliency.
Man, you said my word right there. That's my favorite word, is resilience, right? And I think that's ultimately deep down what everyone craves, is they want to be able to do what they want to do when they want to do it, and be able to be adaptable. You know, for so many years, I was a professional bodybuilder, and my resilience was probably zero. I was very good at a very specific thing. But the idea now is like, you know, I want to be able to throw down and do whatever I want to do. So I'm glad you brought that word up, because that's an important word to me. That's kind of what I strive for. You know, I want to be able to sprint. I want to be able to play hockey. I want to be able to play baseball. I want to play basketball. I want to be able to, you know, deadlift 500 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I want to be versatile and resilient. And that's an important thing to me. Talk to me a little bit about, you know, within your 3 time a week full body split, how you would vary sets and reps and volume and, you know, obviously very, very dependent person to person, but do you have some typical, like one of your favorite workouts that you've put together on how you've seen the greatest amount of progress and how you would progress it?
Yeah, another good question. So this goes back to the impetus of my loading parameters. You know, most people, when they train for strength and size, like to use a load that's around a 6 to 7, 8 rep max, somewhere in there. Now, I don't want to get caught up too much in percentages, because they can really vary with people. Like, for instance, 85% of 1 rep max. Some people like to use that, and I do too. There's a time and a place for that. But let's just say somewhere around, you know, 5 to, you know, 7 reps per set. And I found that around like 4 or 5 sets is, you know, pretty optimal for that. So what I'm getting to here is that when I started thinking about this great question you asked, when I started accumulating a lot of data from training programs and athletes and non-athletes alike that I trained, I found that per workout, per training session, somewhere around 25 total reps with a load that's around, you know, 82 to 85% of 1 rep max was really optimal. And I want to give credit where credit is due. This goes back to Bill Starr's The Strongest Shall Survive program, you know, a classic book. He made the 5 sets of 5 popular. And I'll say that somewhere around there, the 5 sets of 5 with around like 82 to 85% of 1 rep max really hits the sweet spot for most people. So that was kind of the first real note I made, you know, about my principles, you know. So I like that. Again, I'll do a full body circuit. And just to be clear here, what a full body circuit is, it's an upper body pull, it's an upper body push, and it's some squat, deadlift, or lunge variation. An example would be a row and a chest press and a squat, or a pull up, a dip, and a lunge. You can just go on and on. There's a lot of exercise you can fit in that category. So then as I started really thinking about, okay, 25 total reps with that, around that load seems to be optimal.
Optimal for growth or for strength?
Well, you get a mix of both. That's what's good. You know, obviously for strength, you know, the best is 1 to 5 reps per set. But, you know, depending on the volume, it might not be ideal for muscle growth. So kind of hitting that spectrum where, again, I'm thinking about what do most guys want? When I'm writing an article for T Nation back in the day or whatever, I'm thinking, you know, most guys want to get bigger and get stronger, you know. So for that whole range of building strength and size, I think that 25 total reps works really well. But then, you know, the body adapts. As we all know, the body adapts very quickly. So you can't do 5 sets of 5 forever. And that's when I was thinking about, all right, how can I tweak this? Well, I can do 6 sets of 4, you know, so that's 24 total reps, you know, close, about the same volume for that 85, 82% of 1 rep max. But then I thought, well, I think that's maybe a little bit too similar to 5 sets of 5. So that's when I started getting into 3 reps per set. So doing 8 sets of 3, and then maybe even working up to 10 sets of 3. You know, 10 sets of 3 with my brand got a lot of traction because people like that whole thing of me saying, instead of 3 sets of 10, try 10 sets of 3 and hear are the, you know, benefits of that. Not that 3 sets of 10 isn't beneficial. We know it is, but, you know, you want to keep mixing things up. So that's how I got down that spectrum to doing 3 reps per set. And I liked it. People really liked it. My clients responded well to it. So then I would do 8 rounds of a circuit. Now, here's where programming becomes very important. So you're not going to have 6 different assistant exercises, you know, and do 8 rounds with it. So the core of the workout, so to speak, is going to be this pull up, whatever, press and, lunge or squat variations. So you're going to do that for 8 rounds and do 3 reps with each set and have around, 82 to 85% of 1 rep max, for the load, and keep a constant load for all sets. I actually am someone that I like to do constant load training, not all the time. There's a time to ramp up and ramp down and do all that. But I'm trying to make things as simple as possible for people. So it's like, all right, you did 8 rounds or 8 sets, in the circuit of 3 reps with 225 pounds for the exercise. So now it's very clear what your volume was, what the training parameters were for that workout. So the next time you repeat it, it's like, hey, I'm going to use that 225 again. And every other set, I'm going to try to get 4 reps instead of 3. Or I'm going to add, maybe 2 to 3% load and try to get the 8 sets of 3 with it. And it's not always perfect, because especially as you get more experience, you can't progress that quickly, but it gives you very clear parameters to try to beat the next time or to try to, manipulate the variables the next time.
Very, very cool, man. I like that a lot. So progressing, one of the first question that came up was if you're doing 3 exercises, are they all in the 3 rep range or are they variable? And then subsequent to that are meaning like, are you doing, 3, 3 and 3 or in the progression throughout the week? Is it always going to be, all 3 workouts going to look the same?
Well, again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. I always try to make things as simple as possible with programming. So I often like to start people off with doing the same reps for each exercise. So for instance, on Monday, you're going to do a circuit of 8 sets of 3. So you're going to do 8 rounds of the circuit, 3 reps with each exercise. So it could be, a pull up, a close grip bench press, and a deadlift. And you can...
You're just going to have that one circuit, or would you have multiple circuits in the workout, or just those 3 exercises?
It can be just those 3 exercises, because I know that if I have an athlete or someone who's really limited on time, I know that with those 3 exercises, if they're programmed correctly, they're going to hit all their major muscle groups. Yeah, they might not bring up the middle deltoid, the lateral deltoid, as much as they want. If they're a bodybuilder, we might have to do, extra stuff for that. But if we're just talking about building full body functional strength, I know that with the right programming of a full body training session, that I'm going to hit all the major muscle groups. And then how I'm going to make sure that the muscle gets hit from different angles and we get the optimal stimulus throughout the week is the next training session. So Wednesday, so that was Mondays. So on Wednesday, then I'm going to use a different set rep scheme. So I might do 5 rounds of 5 reps per set, and I'm going to use different exercises. A key component of my programming is with those 3 full body training sessions per week, I'm going to use different exercises for each training session throughout the week. That helps avoid stagnation. That gives you optimal muscle development. It's just better overall for performance, all that. So if I did a deadlift on Monday, especially for 3 reps, I'm going to think, all right, I want to unload the spine. 48 hours later, I'm not going to be doing have them doing a heavy barbell back squat. All right, because I want to manage fatigue. That's the key component here, is managing fatigue. So almost always use some sort of single leg variation. So the deadlift obviously is a hip hinge pattern. It's going to really emphasize the posterior chain. You're not going to get a lot of quad stimulus. So on Wednesday, I'm going to do some sort of single leg. So I'm using single leg in quotations, split stance, something that unloads the spine. So I might use a split squat, or I might use a lunge for that workout for the leg exercise, or some sort of step-up variation. So we're getting a sort of quad dominant exercise, unloading the spine, and then we're managing fatigue throughout the week.
Hey, I interrupt this episode to bring you a very special message about protein. Leading the conversation around protein, I get so many questions daily about, man, how much do I eat? Does quality matter? Does it have to be a complete source of protein? And the answer to those questions is, I have no idea how much protein you need. And yes, quality does matter. But how you are going to determine how much protein you need is simply by assessing your recovery, assessing your body composition, assessing your goals. And it has to be a very subjective thing. So starting off with about 1 gram per pound is a high amount, but it's probably advisable for most of the people in this demographic listening to this podcast because you're training, you're active, you're breaking down muscle tissue, and you're probably trying to improve your body composition at some level. So starting at a gram per pound is where I like to advocate. And you can obviously go up from there. You can obviously go down from there if you don't feel like you need it, but that's a really good foundational place to start. But if you feel like you're not recovering, if you feel like you need more calories, if you're still hungry, try some more protein. It's not going to hurt you. There's no negative effects from too much protein as long as you have proper functioning kidneys. If you have kidney issues, absolutely consult your physician or your nephrologist to determine what your protein intake should be. Now, if muscle building is your primary goal, the most important thing with protein is making sure you're getting diverse types of protein and that you're breaking them down. The biggest problem I see with people who are aspiring to build their best body is they're not digesting protein. They eat stuff and they're bloated. For years I ate chicken and I felt terrible. I eat 8 ounces of chicken and I'd feel like I ate 3 pounds. It just didn't digest for me. And it's not about what you eat. It's about what you absorb. So if you're someone out there who's trying to consume 1 gram per pound of protein, I highly suggest you're supporting digestion. And that comes in the form of hydrochloric acid, HCl, and proteolytic enzymes. And if you're not taking those, probably with every meat-containing meal, especially for someone who's really trying to optimize growth or someone who's trying to optimize muscle maintenance on a low-calorie diet. Both of those are absolutely essential times in your life where you want to be taking support to that digestive system. Ultimately, if you're trying to get in extra calories, especially if you're trying to gain tremendous amounts of muscle, you need to support digestion because one of the biggest issues right now that we face in this world is GI distress, right? Because we're consuming so many unnecessary pharmaceuticals, we're consuming so much extra chlorine in the water, we're destroying the gut microbiome, and which is preventing our bodies from doing, our bacteria in our bodies preventing from doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I highly suggest you guys are taking some enzymes and some HCl, both of which I'm going to advocate Mass Zymes from Bioptimizers. Now, it's a great friend of mine who started this company. He's been sending me this product for years, and I absolutely love it. If there's a really cool demonstration you guys can see on his website where literally he just drops a couple capsules of this stuff into water, and you can literally watch the meat dissolve and break down into effectively like a liquid, which is super cool. Just watching an enzyme break it down and showing you its efficacy. So you guys can all get hooked up with Mass Zymes from Bioptimizers, and you're going to get 15% off your entire order during this month using the code MuscleBen18, MuscleBen18, masszymes.com. Go check it out and enjoy the rest of the episode with Dr. Chad Waterbury. Excellent, man. One of the things that you mentioned on your website that I thought was really interesting that I do a lot is, and I may not be using your exact term, but matching exercises. So matching antagonist exercises. So I don't know if that's the exact term you use, but what you're talking about is if you're doing a bench press in the horizontal plane or, in the frontal plane, you're also going to be doing a pull in that plane as well.
Yeah, and that just makes programming simpler. It's very clear for maybe some inexperienced strength and conditioning coaches or personal trainers out there. Just think whichever direction, whichever angle you're pulling, then do the opposite for pushing. So you're doing a pull-up and you're doing an overhead press in one training session. You're doing a row and a bench press the next training session, as you mentioned. And then, it can be, you can do some sort of variation of an upright row. Upright row is a tricky exercise, but some sort of variation where you're not pulling perfectly horizontal, but you're pulling somewhat at an upper angle, but not like straight up where you're really getting that shoulder impingement. But if you just think about that, if you're doing a row, like a low pulley row, so you're standing, but the pulley is set on this lowest position and you're rowing. So the line of resistance, it's down at an angle. So the opposite for that would be, so the opposite for that, if you're, pulling from something that's low, is pushing at a downward angle. Sure. And what's that? That's a dip, or that's a decline bench press.
Decline press.
So you really can't go wrong with that. Pull up, overhead press, one training session, row, horizontal press, next training session, some sort of variation of an upright pull. It can even be a high pull, for people who like to do Olympic lift variations. What I'll do is I'll do some type of, from a hang, do some type of, high pull from a hang, and then alternate that with a dip. So you get that same opposing antagonist pattern.
Why do you like the combination? What have you found to be the benefit?
Well, there's two things besides the programming, as I mentioned. It's like at the end of the week, you know that you hit the muscles, the joints from every angle. So I'm trying to not overload any one specific movement pattern. You know, I always get a kick out of seeing people in, I'm trying to be very general here, people in a training session doing flat bench, barbell bench press. And then they do flat bench, dumbbell bench press. And then they do flat bench, something else. So what I found is it's less joint strain by varying those angles, which is great, which is what we want. And it's more complete muscle development because it just hits, it hits the fibers. It emphasizes, each angle emphasizes different muscle fibers. So you get better muscle development overall, and you get less joint stress because you're not overwhelming any single joint pattern. That's why I like to do that. And from a programming standpoint, it's very easy to visualize this when, as I said, maybe inexperienced personal trainers or strength coaches out there be like, okay, I want to get complete development. I'm going to do the vertical plane, the horizontal, and then these sort of, upright pull and dip variations.
One of my favorite parts of all this, everything you're saying here, is the idea of stressing recovery. You're doing very different exercise, you're doing very different body parts. The paradigm in exercise now is leading toward avoidance of post-exercise soreness. So tell me your opinion on that. Is soreness a necessary evil with exercise, or is that something we should be avoiding? There's some very different thoughts around that.
Well, as usual, the answer is in the middle. So if you do a new exercise for the first time, if I have a client and he or she comes to me and I decide that a reverse lunge is going to be great for this person, and this person has not done a reverse lunge in 2 months or 6 months or even 3 weeks or whatever, that person is going to be sore from the reverse lunge. There is absolutely no way around it. I mean, to get any sort of training stimulus whatsoever, if you introduce a new exercise, you are going to be sore. That is a normal, healthy part of the training process. That's just how it is. But the next time I have him or her do that reverse lunge, let's say it's the following Monday or 5 days later or whatever it is, that person is going to be significantly less sore with similar training parameters. Then that's good, because you can repeat an exercise, it depends on the person, but let's say you can repeat an exercise 6 times before you need to change the variation. I like the fact that they're not as sore the next time because, I don't want to make someone super sore from every exercise they do because it's overwhelming to the immune system. Now, in the early stages, as I said, it's normal, it's necessary, it's totally fine. But beyond that, I am not seeking muscle soreness. I am not thinking I want to make this person as sore as possible from head to toe, because that is not an optimal way to train. I mean, I think one of the best pieces of training advice, whether you're in the strength conditioning world or in the bodybuilding world, is what Lee Haney said way back in the day. He made that famous statement. He said, stimulate, don't annihilate. And people probably before him said the same thing, but that's what I'm about. I'm not about making someone be virtually incapacitated for the next 36 hours after their training session. I mean, that's not living life. It's like, oh man, I'm in so much pain, I can barely get in and out of the car. Well, that's not really optimal. I don't think anyone wants that. I mean, some of us are masochists, especially when we're younger. It's like, oh man, I feel like I got a great training session because I can barely move. But the problem is when you're that sore and you have to really change, this is the physical therapist side of me coming out. When you're that sore and you have to change your normal mechanics for getting in and out of your car or playing in the park with your kids or whatever, then you're more likely to get injured. You know what I mean? So if your hamstrings or some part of your posterior chain is so just annihilated that you can't bend over to pick up something correctly, now you're putting stress on the disc and you're more likely to get injured. And I could just go on and on with that. But to get back, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. To get back to your question, soreness is a necessary part of training. There's no way around it. when you introduce a new exercise, you're going to be sore for sure. But then beyond that, don't seek soreness. It's not something you seek. It's just something you try to deal with and manage the best way you can.
Chad, one of my favorite things about you when I was doing my research was that you've got an undergrad in neurophysiology of human movement. And that's incredibly fascinating to me because that's one of my fascinations. Talk to me about how you integrate that into your training and how that maybe influences your thought process. Like, ultimately, if it does.
Oh, it absolutely does. So my bachelor's degree was in exercise science. And then, so this is way back in the late 90s. I'm showing my age here. And then I started as a trainer in Chicago, and it was great. I got to be around a lot of amazing people and observe them, from Tim Grover, who was Michael Jordan's trainer, and just seeing all these great people, observing them. Then after a couple of years of being a trainer, I was like, all right, I want to take my education to the next level. And that's when I went to the University of Arizona and I got a master's degree with an emphasis on neurophysiology. And part of my master's degree was working on a study with Parkinson's patients. And it was this perfect, it was like fate, where the timing was just perfect. So this is in the early 2000s, and I had just started writing. I started writing for what was testosterone, .net way back in the day. 2001 was my first article. And then shortly after that, I wrote an article for Men's Fitness on 10 sets of 3. So I was starting to get my name out there, start writing and all that. And that's when I was really hungry for this neuroscience information, because with everything I would study, it kept going back to the nervous system. We know a lot more than we did now, but back then it was kind of like the beginning of this spark. It's like, oh, we need to really start thinking about the nervous system here. Because at that time, what most people would focus on was the muscle itself, making it sore, thinking about the muscle fibers, all that. And all that's good. It's fine. But it made sense to me to step back and think, okay, well, what's driving the muscle? Well, what's driving the muscle is the motor neuron that's innervating those muscle fibers. What's driving the motor neuron? Well, the neurons that are coming down the spinal cord. Well, what's driving the neurons to come down from the spinal cord? The brain. So it's like, all right, if you want to get bigger biceps, I think we need to really look at the brain and how it's controlling the biceps, how it's recruiting motor units and all that. And those are things I was starting to figure out. And that's why I was like, all right, I want to study neurophysiology. So I went to the University of Arizona. They had one spot left in the master's program to work on this study with Parkinson's patients. And what's really interesting about this study is that it was a movement-based study to help people with Parkinson's gain speed and strength. I'm just going to give a quick background here on people who are unfamiliar with Parkinson's disease. People who have Parkinson's disease, they start moving very slowly. They start taking shorter steps. They say they feel like they're walking through quicksand. Now, this is sometimes surprising to people because they'll see someone like Michael J. Fox, the pioneer for Parkinson's research, and they'll see him kind of do some sort of excess movements, right? It's hard for him to sit still. And they think that that is Parkinson's disease. It is absolutely not Parkinson's disease. That's not what it does. That is a side effect of the drug you have to take, synthetic dopamine, to deal with the Parkinson's. So what happens is when someone is suspected of having Parkinson's disease, what the doctors do is they give them a low dose of something called synonymous, which is a synthetic dopamine. And if they give them a low dose of it and the person feels better, the person's like, oh, wow, I feel like I can move more freely. I feel like I'm faster. And the patient is super excited. But the sad truth is that's actually how Parkinson's is diagnosed. At least it was back then. I haven't been super up on the research the last 6 or 7 years. That's how Parkinson's is diagnosed. And we know that they're not producing enough dopamine. And we also know that in about 8, 9, 10 months, that dose is absolutely not going to work. And we're going to have to give them a higher dose to get a similar effect. And what comes with higher doses are side effects. So someone like Michael J. Fox, the reason why he has all those excess movements is because he's someone who clearly wants a higher dose and is willing to deal with the excess movements as opposed to a lower dose that doesn't really work as well and is going to make him more kind of constrained. So with that in mind, this study I worked on, it was all movement based. It was teaching people to move more explosively, teaching people with Parkinson's disease to move more explosively. And the whole idea was that we hoped that that would change their brain. And the study was actually successful. It didn't have anything to do with their medication or anything like that. We just had them, like from a chair, we'd tell them to stand up as explosively as you can because Parkinson's slows you down. Now, in this study of making people kind of move explosively, walk as fast as they can, take bigger steps, I learned so much about how the nervous system controls movement, how it recruits more motor units, how it makes you more explosive, how it makes you faster, all these things. So what I did is I took what I learned in that Parkinson's population and then applied it to an athletic population. Because what I thought was, wow, if this works well for people who are so impaired neurologically, imagine how these same principles would work for someone who doesn't have the disease or a younger athlete. And that's when I started talking about moving explosively, getting maximum acceleration out of your exercises, and especially the concentric phase, moving the concentric phase, the shortening phase of muscle actions as fast as possible to get greater motor unit recruitment. And then that led to, that whole sort of principle of training, which in some ways was misunderstood, which I can get to. But in overall, that whole thing about moving explosively, I think was really lacking because at the time, we're talking about 2002, 2003 here, there were a lot of tempo prescriptions. Ben, I'm sure you remember this. A lot of, it became in vogue. It's like, all right, we're going to do 4-second eccentric and then a 1-second pause and a 2-second concentric and a 1-second squeeze at the top. And, I understood why those were put into play, but my whole thing that I didn't really like seeing at that time is I saw people moving slower and slower against resistance. There's a time and a place for that, especially in rehab and all that. And if you're trying to emphasize the eccentric phase, that's totally fine. There's a benefit for that. But what I did not like seeing, the bottom line I'm trying to make here, and I know this is long-winded, is for the most part, I do not like the idea of a 2 or 3 second concentric phase. Because if you look at motor unit recruitment, if you are moving a load any slower than you could actually move it, so let's talk here about a 10 rep max. Let's say someone's doing a biceps curl with a 10 rep max. On rep 3 or 4, he or she really has control over the speed of that movement. He or she could move that a lot faster, but if they're doing these tempo prescriptions, they might be lifting very slowly. And what you're doing here is you're basically stimulating and recruiting the smaller motor units. You're leaving the largest motor units that have the most force and growth potential on the sideline. You're not even recruiting them. And then the old school mentality was, yeah, but you go to failure. So you're moving slowly, but as you get to the end of the set, then as you squeeze out those last few reps, the man is agonizing and it's slow and it's grinding, you're tapping into the largest motor units. But if you look at neuroscience, that is not the case. Because if you were actually recruiting your largest motor units at the end of the set, it would get easier. Henneman's size principle says if you're recruiting the largest motor units, then you're recruiting all the other ones below it. So in essence, when someone is going slowly, slower than they could actually move, and then they get that fatigue, and then they get those protons built up, and then they're grinding through those last few reps, what's happened is that the motor units are starting to drop out. That's why the load moves slower, because you have fewer motor units trying to move the load. That's why it gets harder. You're not recruiting larger motor units at that time, because as I said, if you were, the set would actually get easier, because now you'd have more stronger players, helping you. So that was my main point with that, talking about, lifting faster, but always keeping, technique in check. I mean, when people start going faster, then form can go out the window. That's a problem.
Well, that's exactly it, right? That's where the whole skill acquisition thing comes in, man, because so many people are trying to move things fast and they have no business moving things fast. And that's where this becomes a little convoluted, right? As you look at these guys in bodybuilding advocating, you got to move it as fast as possible. And I completely agree with the motor unit recruitment theory. But first and foremost, you got to be moving it correctly and fast with the right muscle, right? And, of the, 10 million people that I've seen train in a gym, I've probably seen 1% or less that actually has the capacity to do that. So there's always this understanding that, for the listeners out there, make sure you acquire the skill first. And sometimes that requires going slower, fortunately and unfortunately, right? Like, I don't know if you agree with that, but I really believe if you're trying to learn something new, there has to be some degree of attention paid to detail.
Oh, that is absolutely fundamental and key. And this is where some of what I was saying was misinterpreted, because it is for the more advanced lifter. And I try to say that over and over, but then beginners, of course, want to do what advanced guys do.
Sure.
Or
even just in the exercises that you're really good at, like just everyone has strong body parts and weak body parts. If you're really good at something, by all means, go nuts, light it up, right? Go as fast as you can. But if you suck at something, or if you can't feel the muscle correctly, if you know your body's going to cheat, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. And that's why I tried to do my best to program exercises that really fit with faster muscle action. So let's think about the one-arm row, Ben, for instance. So imagine you're doing the one-arm row with your right arm and your left knee is rested on the bench, right? Your left knee and your left hand are rested on the bench. You're doing a one-arm row with your right arm. That is a great example of an exercise. If you're stable, it's not a super technical exercise, but that's a great exercise where you can get more explosive on the pulling phase, right? On the rowing phase. There's not a lot of joint stress. If you're doing a one-arm row, there's not a lot of joint stress. I'm not telling people to do these super fast barbell bench presses, where they're bouncing off their chest and things like that. It's about, certain exercises like a one-arm row, or the up phase of a pull up, or things like that, where it's like, all right, try to get more acceleration there. You're going to, tap into larger motor units. And I also want to say that some people maybe misinterpreted when I was talking about moving fast with associating it with heavy loads. And what I tried to make clear was that when I'm talking about moving explosively, this is not with heavy loads. These are with loads that you really have a lot of control over. So let's say at 8 to 12 rep max, all right? Now, if you're using a 4 rep max on an exercise, you're not going to lift explosively, even if you want to. If you're grinding out a 3 rep max in the deadlift, you don't need to be thinking about lifting explosively. I mean, you need to think about keeping perfect form, keeping stiffness, keeping stability where you need it. That's not where you're thinking about moving explosively, because A, first of all, the load won't move explosively, and B, you shouldn't even be thinking about that. You should be thinking about, perfect form. So what I'm talking about are loads that you really have control over the tempo. So lighter loads, so to speak. And we can say it's between 8 to 20 RM,
Right. So talk to me about that a little bit with your neurophysiology background. If I am lifting a weight that say is 85% of my max, I'm doing it for 4, even though I'm physically not able to actually move the weight fast, compared to physically moving a weight fast, how would we compare those two as far as motor unit recruitment, right? So does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Okay.
And this is a great question. It leads into what I was going to say. The other reason why you don't need to really think about your lifting tempo when you're going heavy is because you're already getting maximum motor unit recruitment.
Perfect.
Just by the load itself. So you don't need to worry about that. What I was trying to do was for these other loads, these 12, you do 3 sets of 12 and they're doing these really slow tempos. I was saying, well, you might want to think about, if you're more skilled, lifting faster on the concentric phase, because you're going to tap into more motor units. So my whole principle was, with those lighter loads, you are leaving the largest motor units on the sideline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you some training principles that are going to help you tap into those larger motor units. So you can get that get greater strength gains, greater strength gains, greater muscle gains, greater explosiveness from the lighter loads, as opposed to just doing the slow grind sets. And let me tell you, there is a time and a place for a slow grind set to failure. I mean, the research shows, and Brad Schoenfeld has covered this a lot, where there's research that shows you can use 30% of your 1RM and get comparable muscle growth if you go to failure. So there's a time and a place for that. I like to use that kind of stuff in the high frequency training phases because they're not super stressful if you keep the obviously the load's going to be low and you just keep a low volume and all that. But back to your key point here, you're lifting heavy, you're already getting maximum motor unit recruitment. So if you're using lighter loads, how do you get maximum motor unit recruitment? You accelerate the concentric phase.
One of the things I'm really interested, Chad, is increasing or influencing the recoverability of the nervous system. With your experience and research, did you find anything that you may, tell us that would increase the recoverability of the nervous system? Yeah,
and this is what we're going to get into more like new age things here. This is definitely going to be out of the realm of the meathead stuff, but this is so important. I mean, it's so crucial because recovery is everything. Managing fatigue is everything. Now, it's kind of like, Ben, someone would ask you, hey, what supplement should I take to get ripped? And yeah, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, you need to get a really good nutrition plan down first, right? So there's, things that you can do to help with recovery. There's breathing techniques. The old school Russian sports scientists would use contrast showers, hot shower, cold shower, all that stuff. Those are all fine, and those can be helpful. People are doing cryotherapy these days. All fine, all helpful, but I look at them as the supplement. It's not the nutrition program, so to speak. So the foundation, the first thing you need to do to improve recovery is you need to figure out a way to be a happy, grateful, relaxed person.
Imagine that.
And
I know stronger and more muscular. Imagine that.
Yeah. And hopefully people are not turning off this podcast right now because there's a lot of good stuff to come besides this.
I'm the one that's advocating that, right? I'm the guy who's saying, hey man, if you want to grow, if you want to be performing at your best, you got to do these things.
You got to do these things. So, it's not easy. It's not easy, especially when you're young, you're full of testosterone and you might have, issues from childhood and, unresolved, anger and all this stuff. It's not easy to do this. So you have to practice it. But one simple thing that you can do is before you go to sleep. So when you're lying in bed and there's a million things running through your head, the last thing you want to do for the day is focus on the things you're grateful for. And you can't fake it. You have to be really honest and be like, I'm so grateful for this roof over my head, or the fact that I have this job, or the fact that, whatever it is, it's whatever you're grateful for. If you focus on that before bed, it has a very positive effect on your nervous system, because when you sleep, we all know how important sleep is for recovery. But if you go into sleep with a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, it's not going to be as restorative. It's not going to be as beneficial for your nervous system as it could be if you go into sleep with the right mindset. Then you do it first thing in the morning. Okay, so it sets you on the right foot. So you wake up, you're not out of bed yet. You think about the things you're grateful for. It changes your brain. I mean, it gets down to, this is where I can get really new agey, but they say that everything in the universe is based on vibrations, just the vibrations of just little atoms. And even though we don't have tons of research to show this, we have enough anecdotal evidence to suggest that this is true, that the way you think, it just makes perfect, irrefutable sense. The way you think affects everything in your body. So the way you think, if you're grateful, it's going to affect those little vibrations, which is going to affect the atoms, which is going to affect the molecules, which is going to affect how your nervous system works, which is going to affect which neurotransmitters you make.
There's a lot more evidence than we know. So there's a book called Mind to Matter, and you may want to check that out. It's Dawson Church, who's the guy who popularized EFT, emotional freedom techniques. And I've just finished reading the book, and there's endless quantifiable research now. Like he's probably got 300 or 400 studies that he references in the book that are just quantifying and giving real life examples of when this actually happens. And it's pretty awesome, man. Like it's very evident. We know this, there's definitely a shift toward this kind of stuff. And, your thoughts are creating vibrations, right? And dude, gratitude is the root of everything. And I say this to everybody: if you're mad about something, you have to find a way to find gratitude, because you can't be grateful and pissed off at the same time.
Right, exactly. Right. Now, I'm going to bring this back to a real world example so we don't, lose the audience here. So the best example I can give of this is, imagine that you're on vacation. Imagine that, I'm going to give a specific example, but you can apply it to any sport. Imagine that you, Ben, have really gotten into surfing, and it's just like your passion. I mean, you connect with the ocean, you love how surfing feels. It's the greatest thing. It's the greatest supplement to your life right now. And you go to Costa Rica, and you have a rich uncle who says, "Oh, Ben, I've got this mansion on the beach in Costa Rica, and it's the perfect waves, and I'm going to send you down there for a week. And you don't have to check your Instagram. You don't have to do anything. You're going to do what you love more than anything. You're going to be able to surf all day, just take in the sun. You get to take your 4 best buddies with you. So it's just like, paradise, right?" And we've all sort of been in those sort of situations in life where it's like, oh, I finally got this vacation I wanted. This is an amazing place and all that. And think about like how good you felt, and usually like how much less sleep you needed to feel good. And I'm not advocating getting less sleep. I want everyone to get more sleep. But the idea is you're such a healthier person when you're in that positive, happy mindset. You don't have the stress of work or school or whatever, or financial stress. You're on vacation. You're in the place you love, and you just feel so good throughout the day. You have energy, and you wake up early, and you actually feel good. Like you're looking forward to starting the day. That's what I'm trying to help people get closer to. And obviously, life is life, and it's tough, and you can't be like that every day. But it makes my point that when you're in that mind space, that your head is in that position, it makes such a profound effect on your neurotransmitters, and then on your recovery, and then how it affects your testosterone cortisone ratio. Testosterone goes up, testosterone goes up, cortisol goes down, all these positive things that happen. And then you recover faster, you grow faster, you get stronger faster. And it's awesome once you start to tap into it.
And someone like yourself can explain this all from a neurophysiological level, right? Like what's happening in your brain with cortisol and adrenaline, what's happening in your brain with dopamine compared to, maybe serotonin and GABA, and your neurotransmitters are influencing your, the way you think is influencing your neurotransmitters, and your neurotransmitters are influencing your body. So, it's definitive. We've all felt it at some point. We walk in the room and there's someone in the room who we know and maybe don't like, or they don't have a very good attitude or energy. Mm-hmm. We've all felt it, man. It's there. It's just that sometimes we are unwilling to accept it.
Yeah, it's very true. And my good friend, Peter Park, who works with, he's an amazing endurance coach who's worked with these incredible athletes over the year. He and I were talking about this recently, and he was telling me that his motocross guys, so he would train some of the top guys in motocross, and just by nature, as you can imagine, that sport, just to be clear here, we're talking about, the dirt bikes where they're doing the huge jumps. And I mean, they have to have such incredible athleticism and endurance. But you can imagine the stress of those races and just even the practicing. And he said that he sees it time and time again. When these guys retire from their sport, they look like they are 10 or 15 years older than they really are. They have dumped so much cortisol. There's so much stress in that. He said they all age exponentially. They all have guts, they can't get rid of. They got all this inflamed fat in their body and all that. So there's another real world example. It's like, man, you've got to keep that stress to a minimum, because these guys just by nature and by that sport are not just laid back, easygoing guys. These are high strung guys, is why they're good at that sport. Right. But man, being like that and being the stress of that, and it just goes to show how it can really wreck your body. Or another example is these ultra marathon runners. And you look at someone who does ultra marathons who's in his or her 40s, and it's just like, man, the stress that puts on the body. I'm all for healthy cardio. We can get into that if you want, but it's just, there's extremes. The body doesn't want extreme stress. And the worst type of stress comes from the brain. That's the stuff you can really control. People who want to run 100 miles in a day, if that's their passion, I'm not going to tell them otherwise. That's the stress you have to do your best to overcome. But the mental stress, being grateful, surrounding yourself with people who are positive, those are things we can all control, and it will absolutely improve your recovery better than anything, and help you get stronger and bigger and faster and just be a happier human being.
Love it. So since you brought up the cardio piece, I would like to talk about that a little bit. On your website, there's some stuff. Actually, I think it's you and Pavel that you reference on the site, talking about how to get the greatest adaptation in someone's endurance and staying out of the lactic energy system. Is that is that something you want to talk about?
Oh, absolutely.
Great.
And I'll just say that if we were doing this podcast about 14, 15 months ago, my answer to cardio, what I would recommend, is significantly different than it is now.
Great.
It's all because of Pavel's strong endurance seminar. And I don't own any stock in strong endurance. Pavel's just one of these amazing people out there. And he's a guy who will research for 3 years before he releases his book. And I have the pleasure of a meeting with him, and he, we bounce ideas off of each other and such, because we live in the same area in Santa Monica. So I got to see him for these 3 years make this strong endurance manual. And man, it just absolutely blew me away. The research he did, and luckily he can understand Russian, and of course he can understand English perfectly. So he could coalesce all these different types of research. And he came up with these endurance training parameters that are just phenomenal. I mean, everyone out there, if you have a chance to go to a strong endurance seminar, please do it. There's not a lot of them, but it's amazing. So I just want to preface that with what I'm saying here, is so much of it is based on that. This stems from, Pavel talks a lot about anti-glycolytic training, and this came from Yuri Verkhoshansky. And probably a lot of your listeners out there will know Yuri Verkhoshansky, Professor Verkhoshansky, who's no longer with us. He was the co-author of Super Training, a book that all of us meatheads and, coaches have. I mean, that was like one of the Bibles. Yep. Well, he is like one of the absolute godfathers and the strongest, one of the smartest sports scientists, in the history of the world. And his daughter is carrying on the legacy now. But anyway, he came up with, around 1980, he came up with this idea of anti-glycolytic training. And essentially what that means is you're trying to avoid the burn as much as possible. So if I give the most extreme example of glycolytic training, it would be the Tabata protocol, the real one, the gnarly one. The 20 seconds and 40 seconds of rest, and right. for 4 minutes of just brutal, hell. You feel like you want to throw up, and it's just the most crazy metabolic acidosis that you can imagine. Well, the Verkhoshansky's whole concept was that instead of beating down athletes, and instead of trying to make them endure that type of training more, his idea was he wanted to build the opposite ends of the spectrum, to stay away from that metabolic acidosis. So the whole idea was, Verkhoshansky's like, I want to make people super strong, build their explosive power. So let's talk about, let's call it your explosive performance less than 15 seconds. You can go really hard for 15 seconds and you don't feel like you're going to throw up, if you get plenty of rest, right? So it's very short. Whereas if you grind out like the hardest 2-minute run imaginable, you're full of acid and you're full of metabolic acidosis. So his thing was, I'm going to build the high end output. So build your maximal strength, full body maximal strength, and build your phosphagen system. So that's the ATP in your muscles and the creatine phosphates. I don't want to get too much into that. I'm just going to call it your maximum output for up to, let's say, 15 seconds. Then he wanted to do the other end of the aerobic spectrum and do aerobic work that was below the anaerobic threshold. So this would be a heart rate that you can sustain for 30 minutes. This is whether you're doing shadow boxing or whether you're practicing line drills for football or whatever. You're not moving explosively. You're keeping it under the anaerobic threshold. That was the birth, as Pavel talks about in his Strong Endurance, of the anti-glycolytic training around 1980 from Verkhoshansky. Well, in the Soviet athletes and all these amazing athletes that dominated sports for so many decades, that was a lot of the type of training that they would do. But here, the Western style was, we wanted to chase acidity. We wanted to hammer ourselves and be like, man, if you threw up during a sprint session, that's when you were really working hard. That's when you were making progress. And there's more and more research and evidence coming out showing that metabolic acidosis, man, that is not a good thing. You do not, some levels of it, the body will adapt to the demand that's placed on it. So a little bit of metabolic acidosis is important. And I'll get to that when I talk about the pump and bodybuilding in a little bit. But a little bit of metabolic acidosis is important. So the body adapts. But pushing your body in a metabolic acidosis, people doing these gnarly sprint sessions with super short rest periods, or these insane, protocols for sled pushing. I'm pushing as hard as I can for 30 seconds. I'm going to rest 15 seconds and do 30 seconds again. And you're just like exhausted and you're just so acidic. It seems like, the research is showing that it can be detrimental to your nervous system health, to your heart health. All that metabolic acidosis could damage otherwise healthy proteins. So there's a lot of reasons, health reasons, why you might want to stay away from it. But let's just talk about performance. Let's say someone doesn't care about that. It's like, I'll do whatever I can. If these crazy Tabata sessions are what I need, that's what I'm going to do. I don't care about the health benefits. Well, from a recovery standpoint and from managing your neurological health and your heart health and all that, you're going to be much better off by not doing those gnarly sessions with short rest periods. And I want to be clear here. I'm all for maximal sprints, maximal sled pushes, all that. The difference is, because of what all Pavel's research and what he taught me, is now I'll do it for shorter bouts. So instead of having someone grind out a 30-second prowler sled push, I'll just do 10 seconds. And I'll also give them longer rests than I would have in the past, because this keeps them out of that glycolytic energy where they're burning tons of sugar and making tons of acid. And just to be clear here, people think, oh, lactic acid, I'm trying to not make lactic acid or lactate. Lactate really isn't the problem. Lactate actually fuels your efforts. The problem is lactate is guilty by association, because when lactate goes up, the protons go up. The protons are what's causing the muscle burn. It's what's causing you to move more slowly. It impairs muscle contraction speeds. It impairs nerve transmission speeds. I can go on and on. So it just makes sense that instead of, this goes back to Verkhoshansky, instead of making athletes just endure this, make them better able to withstand that sort of metabolic stress. So when they are in a competition, they have the capacity to clear those protons more effectively, or to increase their output by getting really strong and getting really explosive. Because the higher your output is, then when you do a lower output task, it's less stressful. The perfect example is that you can, I'm sure, relate to, Ben, is if I have a guy in the NFL who wants to do well in the bench press test, which is a moronic test for an NFL player, but that's a whole nother issue. But, they have to do 225, as many times as they can, right? So if I have a guy who comes to me and his max bench press is 295, how many reps is he going to get with 225? Not very many, right? If I get his 1 rep max up to 350, he's going to be able to do a lot more reps with that 225. So what I've done is I've increased his high end so that with a sub-maximal task like that, he's going to be able to do it easier with less stress. And this gets back to Verkhoshansky's thing. He wants to increase their strength and their power output as high as he can, so that when you are a football player and you need to do quick bursts or sprints or whatever it is to try to tackle your guy, it's less stressful to your body. And then he develops the aerobic base to help clear the protons, to help clear all the lactate in his blood more quickly for the next bout. Because that's a whole nother topic we can talk about, is that, linemen football linemen, all these sports you think are completely anaerobic, even a baseball player, they need an aerobic base. They benefit from an aerobic base because for two primary reasons. One, they're going to recover more quickly between bouts of exercise. Now, with a baseball player, that's not a huge deal. There's a lot of time, between plays or whatever. But for a football player, that's absolutely key. And the other thing is that it's going to help him or her recover more quickly between games. So if you're a baseball player or a basketball player in season and you have 3 games per week, that's a lot of stress to the body. By having that aerobic base that you built in the off season, it's going to help you recover more quickly between games.
Very, very cool, man. Super interesting stuff. Tell me how that might apply to bodybuilding. So should we be avoiding anything that's over 20 seconds to avoid the accumulation of protons?
Well, I don't like to,
sure,
I don't like to
question,
give black,
right?
black and white answers. I'll just say this: high intensity interval training, it's a great way to develop your type 2 muscle fibers, so your largest motor units. So that's good. If it's programmed well, it can be great for your endurance, your overall cardio. So I think bodybuilders should do high intensity interval training, but yes, I do not think they should be doing sprints longer. When I say sprints,
even specific to their weight training though, like if we're talking about energy systems and we start doing sets that are exceeding 30, 40, 50 seconds, and obviously getting a tremendous amount of acid accumulation. And did Pavel talk anything about how that would influence muscle building itself?
Great question. Now, here's where I sort of have to talk out of both sides of my mouth, because the stress on your system for pushing a loaded sled as hard as you can for 45 seconds is exponentially greater than if you do a set of push-ups to failure, right? So you want some sort of acidosis in the muscles at certain times, especially with low loads. This goes back to what I was saying before, that you can use 30% of your 1RM and get great muscle growth. That's a lot of reps you're going to get out of that, but you have to train to failure, because a little bit of acidosis in the muscles is a trigger for muscle growth. Too much is going to overwhelm the system. It's Pavel gave the example in his strong endurance seminar of this woman who had these extremely large calves, and she wanted them smaller. So she worked with some Russian sports scientists, and what the Russian sports scientist did to make her calves smaller is he made her do the most grueling sets of calf raises to failure that you can imagine. When most people would want to quit, he would make her burn it out even more. Now we think, God, this is crazy. And this is the thing that I told Pavel after that I was not sold on. I was like, I don't believe that I believe that happened, but I don't believe that would be the case for the vast majority of people. And then through the way he explained it, and then thinking about some other examples, I realized, wow. So what was happening is the doctor wanted to induce so much acidosis in that muscle that it would damage the proteins and essentially make them smaller. It worked. I don't recommend trying this at home, but it essentially worked. Now, if he would have backed off, and as soon as she achieved the pump, stopped the set, she would have actually gotten growth out of it. It's just he pushed her into this gnarly territory. But I know probably guys like Arnold and other guys who really struggle with their calves, it worked for them. But the point is here that I want to make is that with light loads, you want to get some metabolic stress. Again, Brad Schoenfeld has talked about this, the different ways, the different triggers for hypertrophy, and one of them is metabolic stress. So that is the accumulation of protons within the muscle. And I just want to mention this. Bodybuilders would extol the virtues of the pump, Arnold, all these guys. And then some scientists came along and said, oh, there's no basis for the pump. It's BS, all this. There absolutely is a basis for muscle growth and the pump. The pump comes from proton accumulation. That's one of the main triggers for that. And that proton accumulation and that manageable, that's the key word I want to use here, that manageable acidosis in the muscle is a trigger for muscle growth. So if we're talking about individual muscles, you want to make your quads bigger, you want to make your biceps bigger, whatever. You want to train heavy. You gotta, you want to have that in there. You want to get maximum tension in the muscles, but there's a benefit to doing lighter load training and going to failure. Go to the pump. When you get to the pump though, stop. You've achieved everything you need to achieve for the growth for that set. You don't want to chase more damage, more fatigue. It's just like icing. When I tell people, when you ice a muscle, as soon as it's numb, stop icing. Because if you ice for too long, there's a chance where you can actually damage tissues. Once it's numb, you've done everything you can. Don't keep the ice on there. Once you get the pump, stop the set. Don't try to grind out more reps. So then you can manage the acidosis. So I just want to say one more thing here before we move on. I just want to make clear that that there's a huge difference between doing a full body activity like a sled push or even a sprint or whatever, and getting a metabolic acidosis than it is for just a single muscle getting an acidosis. So hopefully this is clear to people.
Chad, man, you're such a wealth of information. This is incredible. Obviously, you're a guy who knows this stuff very, very well, man. I'm very grateful. You seem like the kind of guy who I'd like to ask this question. This is mostly for personal benefit. What are the 3 books you recommend to people, or what are your 3 favorite books?
Oh, boy. It depends on what the goal is. Is this for muscle growth?
Yeah, man, you could pick it. I know that people ask me that all the time. I'm like, I don't know what area. So you can pick one. You can pick one for muscle if you like, and you can pick one for life, and maybe one for I don't know what you pick it, man. Anything that comes in your mind.
Okay, so for life, for business, the classic How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think that is a great one. That is the key, because when young personal trainers ask me, how can I, move forward and become a successful trainer and get more clients and all that, what physiology book should I read, whatever, say, you've got to be a likable person. You have to know how to communicate.
Yeah.
Yes. You have to be a good human being and know how to communicate with people. And that is probably, of course, this takes a lot of practice, and, it's probably not going to work for everyone, but that is one of the best books. Just, it really teaches you a lot.
And having security in yourself, man, like those things tied together, right? And that takes a long time to achieve. I think a lot of people, the reason they're not nice to people is because they're insecure in themselves and they're hiding something or feel like they have to hide something. And I think there's a lot to be learned there for a young trainer, is being a good human being, being kind to yourself first so that you can be kind to other people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now for training, I mentioned super training, that's a classic. You just can't go wrong with that. I mean, there's just so much information in that book. I would just say, look, if you're going to be a strength coach or a personal trainer or athletic trainer, whatever, and you want the one book, that's just, it just covers so many different elements. And they were so ahead of their time in a lot of sense. But that's absolutely terrific one. Oh, you asked for 3 books here. Now it's going to get tough. Oh boy. Man, oh man. I got to think about
this. What's the most recent one you've read?
The most recent book I've read that I thought was really terrific was Drive. That's another,
Daniel
personal.
Pink?
Yes.
Is that Daniel Pink? Yeah.
Daniel Pink. That was really great. Essentialism is an absolutely terrific book. Have you read that one?
I think I've got it, but I don't think I've read it yet.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I'm going totally blank here on like books for hypertrophy. Of course, I love Huge and Hurry, my book, but
we'll link to that in the show notes for sure.
God, oh man. I'm looking at all these books in my office right now. I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, if I say that one, then I don't want to offend this person because I didn't mention the other one.
Which of Pavel's books is your favorite?
God, that's a tough one too. I mean, I have been so engrossed in his Strong Endurance Manual.
Okay.
So when you take the seminar, it is just so much information, and it's not written as a book. It's just bullet points. I mean, of all this amazing research he's gone through, that is what I've been absolutely immersed in as I'm working on this textbook that I'm writing now. That's a great one. But Simple and Sinister, I think, is absolutely terrific because he's the master of making the complicated simple. And that's one I would recommend. I don't have any favorites with him because it's all like, it's a terrific book. Can't go wrong with any of them.
Thanks very much, Chad. Man, I appreciate your time and your wisdom. And where can our listeners find more from you?
You can visit my website, chadwaterbury.com. And if you're looking for my books or my products, I got a 10-week corrective exercise certification course, and I'm got a few books out there. I got Powerful Mobility on Amazon. It's just $9.99, $10, and a lot of corrective exercise courses. But just go to chadwaterbury.com, click on my store tab. You'll see what I offer there. And then the other thing is I'm doing a lot more on Instagram these days. So you can follow me at Dr. Chad Waterbury, so Dr. Chad Waterbury, and you'll see me post various things. So that's where I'm doing a lot of my social media stuff these days.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much once again for your time. I truly appreciate it.
Oh, Ben, it's my pleasure. It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.